Hello and welcome to another episode of Mergers and Acquisitions, a multimedia blog and podcast brought to you by the Society for Economic Anthropology. I'm Ipshita, and today I'm bringing two very special guests for the second episode of the Enterprise Collection. My guests today are Professor Walter Little and Professor Lynne Milgram. They have spent years studying enterprise, social enterprise, and entrepreneurial labor, and it is a real treat to have them both here together. Walter Little is a full professor of anthropology at the University at Albany, SUNY, with a PhD from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. He studies the social and political economies of Latin American indigenous peoples, particularly in Guatemala, Mexico, and in the Albany, New York region. His multi-sited ethnographic research combines political economy and interpretative perspective in order to better understand the politics of identity, economic development, cultural heritage and tourism in urban places, and the everyday practices of handicraft production and marketplace interactions. He's the author of numerous articles, books, and reviews, including Mayas in the Marketplace, Tourism, Globalization, and Cultural Identity, which won the Best Book of 2005 from the New England Council for Latin American Studies, and Street Economies in the Urban Global South 2013, co-edited with Karen Tranberg Hansen and Lynne Milgram, which won the Society for the Anthropology of Work Book Prize in 2014. Walt has a book that has just come out, Norms and Illegality, Intimate Ethnographies and Politics, co-edited with Cristina Panella. And we also have Lynne Milgram, the full professor of anthropology at Ontario College of Art and Design University in Toronto. Her research in the Philippines analyzes alternative economies, informality and extra-legality, and gendered work regarding crafts, the used clothing trade, food provisioning, and public market redevelopment. Her recent publications include Social Entrepreneurship and Arabica Coffee Production in the Northern Philippines, Navigating Opportunities and Constraints, published in the Human Organization in 2021, Fashioning Frontiers in Artisanal Trade, Social Entrepreneurship and Textile Production in the Philippine Cordillera, Southeast Asia Research 2020. She's also the co-editor of Street Economies in the Urban Global South, co-edited with Karen Tranberg Hansen and Walt Little, 2013, Economics and Morality, Anthropological Approaches, co-edited with Catherine E. Brown, 2009, and Material Choices, Refashioning Bast and Leaf Fibers in Asia and Pacific, co-edited with Roy Hamilton, 2007. So again, welcome Walt and Lynne, and thank you so much for coming on to the podcast.
Thank you.
Thanks.
So I just wanted to begin by asking you a recurring question that we have asked so many of our guests here, just to kind of start off the discussion, which is, what does economic anthropology mean to you?
Take it first, Lynne, or I can speak if you want. For me, it is basically putting people first, and then looking kind of cross-culturally and comparatively for alternative ways of thinking about and thinking through the economy. One of the things I like about Keith Hart's essays on the human economy is that he's reminding a lot of people beyond anthropology, but it's a good reminder for us anthropologists to think in economic terms in ways that put us, human beings first, people first, and that's my main orientation.
Good. I think that I can really just build on what Walt has mentioned to say that, anthropology itself is holistic. And I think that we both feel that economic anthropology really enables that holistic lens to realize the way people work across macro, micro systems, and that any alternatives that people come up with are originating with them, and that our on the ground, really specific long-term studies enable us to see the multiple systems and the multiple perspectives within which people function. And I think that it is that focus not only on the ground, as I say, individual activities, but always looking at them cross-culturally, as Walt said, and also in a broader perspective vis-a-vis politics, to know how people navigate different channels. So I think that economic anthropology enables that really holistic lens, as I mentioned.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I think maybe that also sort of ties into your specific research with street economies and enterprise in general, because again, entrepreneurship is talked about through so many disciplinary perspectives, but maybe this is one way in which you're putting the ideas and narratives that people themselves build first. So I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about what you think social entrepreneurship really entails, because that has been so central to both of your work and recent interests as well.
Good. Thank you for that question. I'll just go ahead, Walt?
Yeah, go ahead, and then I'll
Yeah.
jump in.
I think that social entrepreneurship, when you read the literature, is very much an umbrella term now. And depending on the research that you read, different scholars have different takes. So I'll offer one interpretation, and then I think further on in the conversation, we'll look at some of the paradoxes, in that. But the idea with a social entrepreneur, with the emphasis on the social, is that they frame a very cross-sector practice. A social entrepreneur really fashions their practice from a very eclectic mix of business, private investment, charity, social movement models. And the idea with the social entrepreneurship is that they want to work with communities to develop not only more income generation for producers, but also socioeconomic, political infrastructure security. And the idea with social entrepreneurship, if you look, is almost like the next step after fair trade. So fair trade was an entrepreneurial model to help people maximize their income generation. But with social entrepreneurship, they're looking more broader, and they're looking particularly to promote business transparency and develop a very high quality product. Initiatives of social entrepreneurship that we might be familiar with today would be something like farm to table, direct trade, direct producer to consumer trade, fairly traded rather than fair trade. So it's a long-term initiative that promises investment sort of in the community. And I think that, through entrepreneurial activity that can be effective at the social level, politically and economically, that recently this has really catalyzed a revolution in consumer behavior, so that consumers, when they look at social entrepreneurial businesses, are now starting to ask, okay, who's producing these goods? How sustainable are they? And who controls how these goods are represented, value added, and who is reaping the benefit. There are some paradoxes with social entrepreneurship that we can talk about a little bit later, but I thought maybe that gives a basic premise for what we're talking about when we look at how different entrepreneurs can take advantage of opportunities, mitigate constraints in the endeavors that they're trying to work on the ground.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like Lynne was saying, it is kind of a logical progression from fair trade to this concept of social entrepreneurship. I see it as kind of another wave of kind of development policy towards, and one of the things that that we noticed, and we were in conversation with another anthropologist, Brandon Lundy, and I guess for maybe 4 years or so, we've been kind of discussing this, because social entrepreneurship is seen within this kind of broader global economic and development discourse. And it's often outsiders, and outside of these communities are kind of almost imposing their ideas on places around the world, places that are, for whatever reason, deemed underdeveloped. And our conversation is kind of stimulated first by this global discourse, and what's been kind of taken on by business scholars or development scholars or economists, and then taking that and saying, well, how are things actually working on the ground? Are there people who are acting as social entrepreneurs? And for each of our cases, we find that, right? That there is not quite this capitalist winner take all perspective, but good entrepreneurs have their communities in mind, right? They think about the people, right? They have to draw from the labor pool that's local. They have to keep people from being too upset. You can only push exploitation so far. And so while these things may be happening organically on the ground, people in the countries we work in and many others are aware of these global discourses of social entrepreneurship. And so how do these global discourses align or conflict with the on the ground practices, and how from the ground up is social entrepreneurship interpreted? And we're still really in the middle of this discussion and this research. Unfortunately, derailed a little bit by COVID. But that for me kind of is the orientation of what social entrepreneurship would be.
Yeah, and I was going to mention this later, but maybe a couple of things that Walt pointed out, maybe I could build on now, and then later in the conversation, it might be a way to tease out examples from our own research. So, social entrepreneurship, like earlier fair trade, isn't a perfect model, and there's questions that arise. So it definitely has had unambiguously positive effects that I think both our research, would bear out. What Walt pointed out that I'll just build on is the fact that social entrepreneurs are embedded in the capitalist market. And so the question then arises is, again, using one of Walt's terms here, is how far can you stretch the envelope to bring sustainable, in quotation marks, development without jeopardizing your position for informed critique? So in other words, social entrepreneurs aim to have their enterprises self-sustaining. And this might mean forming cross-sector partnerships with for-profit or corporate entities. And in so doing, you help the sustainability of your business, but at the same time, you don't want to then sacrifice your social mandate. So this is kind of the paradox. This is what social entrepreneurs are straddling: to become truly sustainable, which fair trade with more of their moral grounding has not been able to come as effectively as hoped. You're in the capital market. And so how do you maintain your goals, your social alternative aims, at the same time that you're engaging in making enough profit to be sustainable? So that's one of the challenges, I think, as well.
Yeah, that's really interesting. What both of you mentioned about the global discourse and this eclectic mix of different types of characters and actors who might not otherwise necessarily have been in the same room before are now forging these alliances. And there are moments of maybe discomfort. There are moments of maybe having to navigate around things. So that's sort of something that I also felt with my research in India, where there is generally kind of a push towards defining things as social entrepreneurship. And so people who might not have necessarily thought of themselves as social entrepreneurs are being encouraged to think of themselves in those terms. And yeah, like you said, the presence of investors and development practitioners and policymakers, and how that kind of sits with the practices that people have themselves been engaging in, and whether they are how they want to fit their work into these sort of narratives. So I was wondering, in the sites that you both have been working on, has there also been a general rise in interest or push towards social entrepreneurship as this kind of development policy? I know it's happening in different parts of the world. It's like, as you said, a global discourse, really. But has there kind of been this sort of push which has made actors feel a sense of need that they need to kind of maybe define themselves as social entrepreneurs now?
I think it's incredibly variable. right? As to how, where it's kind of, what populations in particular places these discourses are kind of being heard and debated and discussed and used as a way to kind of orient their own entrepreneurial practices. So for Guatemala, which is a very ethnically divided, linguistically divided society with pretty profound class and social differences, it enters in different areas. There are elite non-Maya textile designers that draw on Maya traditions that are embracing kind of this social entrepreneurial spirit, right? And they promote their products in this way of like they're agents of good in the broader kind of Guatemalan society, right? They know how to use that language in ways that ultimately helps their own business make more money, right? And get a wider circulation. I think on the other side of it, you have Maya weavers and those that are kind of just selling in markets or have very small firms that actually practice on the ground really kind of healthy forms of social entrepreneurship because they're part in the community. So one man I met in my recent research is a weaver, and he wouldn't claim it, but I'd say designer too. And he started on tourism and then moved like weaving textiles for tourists as kind of a contract weaver. And he moved into his own business and redesigning traditional women's cortes or ook and cachical. It's like a skirt, wraparound skirt. And as he became more successful and couldn't expand his market, he then started teaching other men and women how to weave and how they could get set up. And rather than say franchising it or being the entrepreneur who then controls a whole stable of weavers, he just shared the ideas and the technology and then set them up with the clients that he can take care of. And so you see this kind of slow kind of web like network expanding with the market so that these other people can make money and do well, and not just him. And I see that as this kind of an alternative form to social entrepreneurship that's like really wonderful, as opposed to this elite kind of textile designer that's still hiring people in traditional ways and using the discourse. Like this guy that I interviewed in Nawala, he knows of these kinds of discourses, but he isn't manipulating them in kind of the market way that this other person is. And so you see these variations play out in places. I have a lot of stories. I've been interviewing all these different weavers that have firms as I study kind of Maya textiles and fashion change. I think we'll talk later about some of these kind of specific things, but I thought maybe one example kind of extremes in just one place might be useful.
Good. I think again, Walt's made a very, very good point about the variety, and I think development becomes professionalized very quickly. So the idea that entrepreneurs are going to save global South economies becomes immediately co-opted. And then social entrepreneurship, I think, is a perfect example of this again, of the sort of the formal sector formalizing informality. Here's a way that we can move production forward. But first of all, not everybody wants to be an entrepreneur. Not everybody's kind of got an aptitude to be an entrepreneur. So on the one hand, you've got the government stressing entrepreneurship, but not for the right reasons. And I think that the variety that Walt mentioned is exactly sort of what I've seen. So two very brief examples from my research in coffee is that I met a Canadian coffee dealer who marketed himself as a social entrepreneur. But basically, he rode around the uplands of the northern Philippines where I worked, the Cordillera, on a motorcycle, basically just galvanizing whatever produce that he could get from farmers, and roasting it and exporting it back to Canada. No investment at all with the community. It took me years to get an interview with someone in the company. And yet he's touted as a social entrepreneur because they have a great marketing campaign. And then on the other hand, I've met two women who are Filipina. Their family had been involved in coffee. And again, drawing on what Walt mentioned, people were already involved independently in coffee production. So these women, wanting to go back to their community with very altruistic aims, wanted to work with these two communities to help them develop a better quality product and at the same time build community infrastructure. And because they were not familiar with the community, having their family had moved out years ago, they spent a good year in the community, going from family to family, integrating in events, taking the appropriate gifts, learning about what people needed, participating, volunteering in farming, and then invited families that would be interested to join this social entrepreneurship idea that they had. And it now is 6 years old, and I've been following them for 4 years. Instead of expanding their network, they've chosen to stay with the approximately 150 to 200 farmers that they've been working with for the last 4 years, and continue to strengthen the community and turn over management of the business to the community. So they're training family members to be the managers, the product qualifiers, looking at pre and post-harvest techniques. So that to me is sort of the complete opposite to this other build social entrepreneur. And so again, I guess we just have to look at how these titles are co-opted, because these alternative economies that we're looking at, and again, this is what economic anthropology can bring to understanding activities. It's like the last frontier for capital to galvanize this informality. And so we see social entrepreneurship as one of those frontier activities that can be very easily misrepresented, I think in both Walt's examples and in this one.
Yeah, this reminds me, Lynn, of the kind of push to give microloans to various places, around the world, right? And I was going to say, in the global South, but you see it in the United States too, with certain populations and probably other countries, similar countries. But the push for microloans behind it was always, take this money to develop a business. Now you're going to be an entrepreneur. And your point about not everybody wanting to be an entrepreneur is really important. Some people just want to be a farmer, right? Or just want to be a carpenter or be a school teacher or an engineer or whatever. They don't want to run a business. I think a lot of us professors are professors because we're essentially okay with being workers, right? I'm a worker. I don't want to run a university. I don't want to start a university. I don't want to be an entrepreneur of education. I just want to be a professor and teach classes and do research and have great interactions with colleagues. And so I think it's kind of I don't know, humorous or sad even if the development push is, here, we're going to give you a loan and you're going to start a business and you're going to then, now with the kind of current discourse of social entrepreneurship, then you're going to do good things for your community. I think sometimes being a good worker and participating in the local economy is a pretty good thing in and of itself, right? So we need to kind of keep that into perspective and understand that a lot of people kind of contribute to what is a good economy. And social entrepreneurship is one way, right? And so when the development push from the outside is do this, do this, do this, and only social entrepreneurship is what we're interested in, I think we're potentially sending a really bad message to other people in the communities where we do our research. Lynn?
I had a grant to look at microfinance with women's craft cooperatives. So very briefly, I just want to reinforce exactly what Walt said, is that the government gave microfinance loans to crafts people in the province I was working, Ifugao, Northern Philippines, to start a business, raising pigs, growing market vegetables, buying yarn for weaving. They did nothing, on the other hand, to ensure market access. So terrific, you've got a big pig, nowhere to sell it. You've got stacks of weaving, nowhere to sell it. So what the government tended to do was judge their success in the money distributed, not with the capacity to build a sustainable business, or with the idea that you were actually capable of this. And what it comes down to is that people had to form into arbitrary groups. And this in a way relates to the social entrepreneurship that Walt talked about with the textile designer, that people weren't used to working together. They were in an arbitrary group. And unless you give long-term sustainability to the people that you're giving loans to, again, drawing on what Walt said, there's no trickle down. So the people that did make a living with their micro loan to sell weavings or sell their pigs, they never felt secure. And because their business wasn't really sustainable. And therefore, there weren't benefits that trickled down because they never felt safe enough in order to let that money go. So people basically became tax collectors for the government. They made money because the loans had to be repaid on a particular schedule. And so the social part of that entrepreneurial model was quite lacking in what I found. And I think it's one of the main criticisms that's come about with microfinance.
And I think this is a continuing problem, right? That all too often there's not an eye on market, right? And you think of all these initiatives to start these businesses and do these things, use this money and develop a new business. But what are the markets? And with the cases I look at in Guatemala that are the most successful are the ones that really, they'll take their microloan money, they'll embrace the social entrepreneurship ideology, but they keep their businesses super local, right? And they're very small scale, and so they're able to pay back their loans and maybe support some others, and kind of adhere or try to adhere to this social entrepreneurship ideology. But those who try to expand anymore, so if you're developing products that are for export, whether it's coffee or broccoli or many kinds of textiles that get exported, then what do you have, right? You have to have you have to have access to a market. You have to have knowledge of that market, and all too often those entrepreneurs don't have that, and there's no infrastructure to help that. And in the case of Guatemala, that it seems to be shifting depending on the product. Textiles. Go ahead.
Yeah, just because both of you mentioned specific instances from your fieldwork, I was wondering, this ongoing project that you have, if you could talk a little bit about the particular sites and community.
So I'll begin. I think you have a couple questions there, so maybe I'll just start and we can, fill in later.
Sure.
I think with both Walt and I, but Walt will speak for himself, I didn't go into my research wanting to look at social entrepreneurship specifically. My research did begin some years ago. My doctoral research looked at the commodification of women's handicrafts in the Northern Philippines. Once I got there, I researched that. I looked at women's craft cooperatives. I looked at microfinance loans that were given. I saw that women took microfinance loans theoretically for their weaving, but instead they got involved in the secondhand clothing trade because they could make more money. So that led me to look at secondhand clothing, that women were, because I'm focusing on women's work, that they were selling in streets and also in markets. Once I got into public markets, I started to research street vending as well as public markets. So the whole point is, it's an organic process. Once you're in the field, the research leads you to the issues because you're responding to what's going on. I actually went originally to the Philippines to look at weaving, but I found out that women were also doing wood carving and basketry. So immediately your inquiry responds to the data. So it's an organic process. And what I found that in each one of these fields that I've pursued, a new group of entrepreneurs emerges. And as security within their trade grows, then they are able to take on what we are understanding is more of a social entrepreneurial role. So in each one, whether it's craft cooperatives or with the coffee research that I'm looking at now, these entrepreneurs see that the only way to have really sustainable long-term producer success, is to invest across sectors. And that's what I have found. So the new group of entrepreneurs, some of them are affiliated with NGOs, some of them are independent. The two coffee social entrepreneurs I mentioned to you who are in my article that have gone back to their family's community, they raise their own funds through fundraising digitally, crowdfunding. They also accessed organizations like Kiva, Coffee for Peace, where they could get initial startup capital. So again, that takes us back to the fact that social entrepreneurs are working across sectors in order to raise the capital that they need. They've got, a foot in a couple of markets. So those are what I'm involved in, and what I'm basically following in both those processes. And the questions, sort of that I'm looking at, basically are to what degree can these social entrepreneurs scale up from their small startup premise and not sacrifice their social mandate. And I'm looking at the different channels that they have to activate to take advantage of opportunities, to mitigate the challenges. Because in the Philippines, like perhaps in Guatemala that Walt can talk about, there's no government support. The government has a great rhetoric of showcasing, we have a great coffee industry, we have a wonderful textile industry, we'll open up a festival, and then nothing. So there's no ongoing infrastructure support. There's no crop insurance. There's no health insurance. So the social safety net is very much what part of these entrepreneurs are focusing on. And so I'm, looking at to what extent they can actually galvanize these. Because we've got a very weak sort of economic infrastructure. Also with banking, we can talk more about some of the challenges with that. So that's basically, what I'm looking at, and hopefully in the long run, can these social entrepreneurs address the infrastructure of society, even in a small way? Or the big question is, are they just alleviating symptoms of inequity rather than shifting around the infrastructure? Because Nancy Fraser, in her book Justice Interruptus, many years ago, framed it very well, that just giving people more jobs or moving chess pieces on the board to take a different position, you're redistributing the wealth maybe, but you're not recognizing the root problem. And so that's one of the things that I'm following up with both of these endeavors.
Thank you. Yeah.
I think there's some, obviously there are overlaps and kind of our interest, especially since Lynne and I have kind of converged in various ways and collaborated on a number of projects. But when I started doing research in Guatemala, it actually had nothing to do with social entrepreneurship. I wasn't even interested in studying weavers and vendors, but rather social movements and the relationship of social movements to my identity and the kind of economic context around that. And I got down there, and identified handicraft vendors as a good population to study because they had access to news media and radio and television. They were relatively affluent, at least the population I was drawing from, and knew about the national Pan-Maya movements that were unfolding. And that had largely only been discussed from the perspective of the elites that were kind of driving the movement, and those who were involved in kind of language activism and other kinds of political fronts. And I thought, well, how is this movement being interpreted by those who aren't directly involved in it, but have access to all the news about it? And so the vendors seemed a logical group, and they said, yeah, we know it's there, but we really don't care, and we have actually some problems with it. And so very early in my dissertation research, I had to come up with another project because there wasn't a dissertation in that, at least from their perspective. I did write one article, an American ethnologist, my first kind of big major journal publication. And a lot of people think that is representative of my career's work, but it's actually just a one-off thing about why my handicraft vendors were out of sync with or dissatisfied with the Pan-Maya movement. And that, so I switched to looking at the ways that the vendors themselves use their identity kind of in strategic or instrumental ways for economic and political security or gain. And that led to me paying attention to everything from the weavers that supplied the textiles that go into the tourism market to the vendors themselves that were right in the middle of the market and doing all these kind of complex identity negotiations to do well. And it just kind of grew in kind of multiple directions. I'm the kind of person who likes my field site. And so I want to know everything I can about Guatemala and about what people are doing. And I just stuck with the weavers and the vendors, and noticed in part from some of my colleagues who work in Oaxaca in particular were saying, hey, we're starting to see a lot of Guatemalan items in Mexico. And one of the fascinating things about Mexico is it's super protective of what it considers national patrimony. And there are all these rules against not having handicrafts from other countries. And the fact that all these Guatemalan textiles were going into Chiapas and Oaxaca and Yucatan, even Mexico City, was really fascinating to me. So I started to look into the transnational vendors that were crossing over into Mexico and developing their products and interviewing on both sides of the border. And that evolved into a project where I'm trying to figure out how that entrepreneurship benefits women. And it's largely driven by women. And so how do they make the connections? How do they develop their market? And I suppose it's partly my reaction to all the other things we were talking about earlier, and the kind of microloan climate where you develop a product but then you don't have anywhere to sell it. These are mainly women and couples or male female pairs. Sometimes it's brother and sister, not spouses, that go together into Mexico, and they assume all kinds of risk in that by crossing borders and with their goods and that and hopefully money when they return. And it's not exactly the safest place in the world. So the idea is to see, well, how can that type of business lead to kind of economic successes and improvement of women's lives in particular. While I was doing that, then that led in turn to, I did most of that work on the Mexican side, interviewing the vendors in Mexico that were receiving it, kind of how how they're interacting with the Guatemalans in that. And then when I went back to find the sites of production, some I knew, and I was just going to kind of go back and pursue this question of why are you selling to Mexico mainly, but they sell to many other countries now, and no one wanted to talk about that. Kind of making me a flashback of the Maya movement stuff in the vendors. I don't even want to talk about that. They're like, we want to talk about Maya clothing and Maya fashion and all the new things that are happening. And then that led to this, the kind of expanded the project to looking at a whole bunch of entrepreneurs who are developing new products. And so the one man that I described earlier from Nawala that makes the type of skirt, he was one of that set. I met another family that the mother, matriarch of the company, started out as a teenager weaving plain cotton diapers because she wrangled a deal to get these fibers. She was particularly fast, they're one color, so they're easy. She built this, saved her money, and built this empire where they sell to China, Korea, Ecuador, Colombia, several countries in Europe. It's this massive thing, and they have 100 around 150 weavers that weave for them. They pay really good wages compared to other types of weaving. They have a real clear sense of kind of what they should be doing for the community, and that fit really into the kind of discussions of social entrepreneurship that we've been having. But it's this kind of connection between, for them, it's and others like them, and I have a whole list of people I've been meeting and learning about their business practices. That the idea of social entrepreneurship is partially, it's about like, I'm a social entrepreneur, I'm going to give better wages, kind of like Lynne was saying. It's a good question that you raised, Lynne, about whether or not it's just treating a symptom, but it's not really leading to any kind of structural change. And you have like this concern, like, we got to pay people better. So the question is, if you're paying people better, does that lead to bigger structural changes? Does it translate to particular voting patterns that would change the structure of Guatemalan politics? I don't know. I think it's too early to tell. But making a little bit more money is certainly a good thing for most people. But the other thing that in that context that they promote is with the textiles, is that they're developing a type of clothing that's Maya-centric, right? My textiles are complicated, not just technologically complicated, but they're complicated in social and cultural ways. And with some of the meaning, there's a lot of pressure to get Maya to give up their clothes, and so these entrepreneurs have been developing new technologies, new ways to make affordable Maya clothing, right? And it's probably not enough time for us to talk about that here, but they're using technology, they're using automated loom machines and embroidery machines to make clothes that are definitely kind of rooted in kind of ethnic and culturally appropriate designs, and they're doing it. And the fact that they can kind of push back and say, well, a woman can wear clothes that are associated with her ethnic identity, and they're affordable, right? As women go into the workplace, like, kind of take a step back, as women go into the workplace, they don't have time to weave clothes in the traditional ways. They can't weave 2 weeks of outfits. It's just almost impossible to do, and they can't afford to buy them because it costs hundreds of dollars. So you can buy these new Maya entrepreneurial made clothes for affordable prices, and you can still represent yourself ethnically.
Mm.
And I think it's really important and really empowering. And so I'm kind of in the middle of all this stuff now. And so there's the money side, but there's all this kind of social cultural side that's important to how they're conceiving themselves as social entrepreneurs. And they're helping that side of things too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And something that sort of struck me from both of what your responses to what I had been asking about the sides was, and I know, Lynn, you also particularly mentioned the larger inequalities within Philippines, within Guatemala. So kind of thinking about the continuum between social movements and social entrepreneurship. I don't know if they are one category versus another category anymore. But in terms of typically, often from my knowledge based in India, there's been some kind of ideological antagonism, you can say an opposition between many of these actors versus, say, investors versus maybe even NGOs versus development practitioners, who are often seen in slightly oppositional terms, even when there are alliances forged between these groups, particularly investors. People who are seen to represent corporate social responsibility sort of models and ways of thinking. So with the movement towards social entrepreneurship and the way there are so many different types of actors who are promoting it, including the government, of course, at least in rhetoric. I was wondering if you see there is like a general co-opting of some of these challenges that might have otherwise taken place, or whether you think this is a less of a challenge to the elites within the social structure, which is why it's kind of it's kind of on the rise, but some of these problems that social entrepreneurs are facing maybe reveals the cracks within this attempt to create an ideologically coherent project towards development or progress or something like that.
I think, well, I can comment on that briefly. Thank you for that question. And I guess I can draw sort of specifically on my research, recently in this new Arabica, specialty Arabica coffee industry in the upland Philippines. And that is, it's a new project, but at the same time, I'm still involved in women's weaving production. So what has emerged in conjunction with your question is that, again, sort of draw on what I mentioned before, is that this idea of social entrepreneurship is like another frontier that can be co-opted by the government. So they'll give rhetoric lip service to it. What has emerged on the ground in some of the enterprises that I've looked at is competition rather than collaboration. So one of the things that farmers need, for example, really are depulping machines to remove the outer pulp from the coffee bean. Some farms are doing it with very homemade depulpers. So what the Department of Trade and Industry, which is the branch of the Philippine government that helps people with livelihood, they've taken on the initiative to give out depulpers. The problem is the machines that they're giving out to farmers are the lowest of the low grade, and therefore they break easily. There's no training in how to fix them. There's no parts to fix them. And the fact that the depulpers that they're giving out are bottom of the line means that they damage the bean. And so there's a huge percentage of coffee beans that are damaged and therefore can't go towards this premium or specialty grade, which the government is also pushing. And different departments of the Philippine government seem to be working not in collaboration. So the Department of Development is giving out coffee roasting machines to farmers to encourage them to value add by roasting their own coffee. So after they've been in the fields all day, farming and producing, depulping, washing the bean, they're then expected after a 10 or 12-hour day to come home and roast their coffee. So one arm of the government is encouraging better quality production up to the green bean stage. That's one arm of the government. the DTI, and then another arm is giving out roasters. And so it's completely working against the suggestion of another arm of the government. So they're competing with one another. And they tend to give equipment to those farms that are closest to the road. And this is one of the challenges of this particular industry, is that most of the farms are like 4 to 6 kilometers from the main road, and the transportation is very limited. There's some very narrow cemented paths that are going in, but mostly you hike in. So the farms that are very close to the road get a lot of equipment and get duplicated equipment, and the farms that are farthest away don't get any. So there's a huge disjuncture, again, between the initiatives that the government thinks they're making, distributing money in microfinance, distributing machine, with no follow-up for capacity building in that regard. So they're working against each other, not to really comprehensively build a solid, sustainable infrastructure. And then, very briefly, to sort of reflect on what Walt has also talked about in handicrafts. Again, the model of social entrepreneurship is pushed with women's craft production, and particularly recently digitally, so that women's craft collectives are being encouraged to market their products globally by using new digital platforms, information and communication technology. The problem is, if you've got most of these artisans that are based in a rural location, they don't have access to the broadband, that they need. They don't have any sort of training or access to the banking where they can facilitate online payment and then shipping and then banking. And so the idea that you're encouraging groups to market online, but then not giving any support, again, is setting people up for failure. So the governments that have really succeeded mostly with this initiative have been in Malaysia and parts of Indonesia, where the government has a sponsored online platform that community weaving groups, for example, led by an entrepreneur, someone who can navigate it, can use the online platform free or with a very low payment, and that there's facilitation for banking and online payments. But that's not available in the Philippines. So again, you've got the rhetoric, go global, be digital, but none of the on the ground, backup for that. So I'll leave it at that for now, and if that answers the question.
Absolutely, yes, yeah.
One of the things that I paid a lot more attention to is are the vendors or the artisans that are not really, or the sector rather, I should start over. I paid more attention to the kind of sectors of the Guatemala economy that aren't tied to foreign investment, aren't in and targeted by the government for these sorts of things that Lynne's talking about, in part because I just wanted to see how people are making it without that. And there is some resistance to some of that, I believe, by some Guatemalans. So if we look at coffee, the coffee sector, for example, in Guatemala, which is has a longer and kind of well-known history than the Philippines, it's largely been controlled by the government, and the development of fair trade coffee introduced some avenues for smallholders to export their crops. There's a little bit of that in textiles as well, and I see that kind of development going back earlier. And the problem, one of the things about Guatemala and investment in Guatemala, it's partly investment to save poor indigenous people, and you had the kind of religious investment in Guatemala, where solidarity movements were built in the 80s during the long period of political violence, and coffee and textiles got sold through church networks, and other types of community organizations in the US, Canada, and Europe. The social entrepreneur kind of discourse, right, in a lot of ways is similar to this earlier kind of religious sort of solidarity movement, where the investors go in to help some poor community do better in some way, and it more often is somehow related to textiles, and it may be textile. They'll be instrumental in kind of encouraging a cooperative to be developed, or a cooperative may already exist, but they don't really have good access to the market. So this outside kind of development agent, social entrepreneur, practitioner will go in and work with the community to kind of develop a market for them. I tend to study more often those vendors who do their own market research, because they're rooted in a tourism economy, and so tourists from all over the world come. They do their own market research. They do their own interviewing to see what people are interested in. They adjust their products to serve that community, while still kind of having their consumers feel that they're buying something authentically Maya. And maybe in contrast to many of the people that Lynne's working with, most of the vendors and many of the weavers are on Facebook. They don't have cutting edge technology, but they've got smartphones that work, and that they have WhatsApp, and they have Facebook, and other social media platforms, and they use them. And so when they meet tourists, they make connections on Facebook. And there's one woman that I've known since she was a teenager, and she's, I have to do math in my head, but in her 30s now, I guess. And she is really adept at this, and so she has this kind of network of people on Facebook and WhatsApp and whatnot. And when COVID shut down all the tourism business, she was able to kind of mobilize her digital media resources and reach out to people and start selling her and shipping her goods to the US and elsewhere. I mean, it's really amazing. It's a pretty small scale operation, but it was all from the ground up in her part. And she's not received any aid from the government, no money from some outside social entrepreneur developer or anything. And she's not alone, right? And it's to be seen how that then translates into a kind of longer term success. But certainly some of the vendors are using the media and digital media in pretty creative ways.
Yeah. I just want to build very briefly on what Walt has said, because it gets right back to one of the first questions that we addressed about economic anthropology, and this idea for geographical specificity, I think, really comes up here. In Walt's area, tourism is really big, and that becomes a key about the accessibility of kind of an immediate market. In the northern Philippines, where one of the craft co-ops that I've worked with is, tourists don't usually go. It's very hard traveling. There's not a tourist industry, yet there's an incredible practice of local Ifugao weaving, the Ifugao province. And there's a very, very successful, he's now an NGO who's devoted to preserving the rice terraces in the area, and also promoting women's weaving of Ifugao textiles. The only way that they can market online is they've got to volunteer in Manila. And this is the article that you have, Walt. So I look at this rural NGO that's producing phenomenal textiles and the digital limitations they have because their broadband cannot support what they want. They've got volunteers in Manila that have just recently, December 2020, fashioned a website, and they're now ready to ship a bit. And then I look at another textile cooperative in Manila, and the difference with them, because of the digital presence that they have a 10-year history, and yet they still have challenges. So both of these are operating independently. They've both accessed a little bit of government support, but their geographical location brings their own specific challenges. So I think it reflects on some of the points that Walt raised with disappearing tourists and people's digital awareness, because in the Philippines, they're on Instagram, they're on Facebook, but it's that next level of banking and shipping that presents a real challenge unless you're in a big city like Manila. That's all.
Right. That is a really important point. So accessibility to kind of global markets is really dependent on the banking infrastructure. So Guatemala has been kind of improving in that way, right? So Ban Rural, the rural bank of Guatemala is in most towns and cities of a certain size, and so as long as you have a bank account somewhere, this is what matters, right? So people who have bank accounts can then access this money, and I mean it's pretty easy to send money now. You don't have to rely on Western Union or anything like that. That takes a huge cut. You can send money directly down account to account. I actually learned a lot more about that this past year because of COVID than I ever had paid attention to. But my weaver and vendor friends were very aware of how those things work, and that it's still, I still think it's tough for them, and probably anyone kind of entering the economy in that way, right, is that you really need trust, right? There's something that when you're in a marketplace, right, I mean, and you're negotiating a price, or you're looking at fixed prices, and that you see the product, right? You see the person selling it, it's right there. But when you're dealing across these digital boundaries and thousands of miles away from the vendor and the product, it's a lot of trust, right? So I think part of the success of companies like Amazon is, as maybe as infuriating as we feel about it, is it comes with this kind of guarantee that they're gonna get the product to us, right? And I think when you're buying from a Maya vendor, you're probably just fine, but it's there in a lot of ways there's no security. Can you trust that the mail is actually going to deliver to your house the product, right? Is the money getting down there to the people who really get it? I know that the first time that I used that system, I was really worried that my money was just going to disappear into the air, and that the vendor that I wanted to work with wasn't going to get anything. You have all these kind of suspicions, right, that you don't have, right? And even in a tourism context, there's so much difference between the consumer and the vendor, right? In the assumption that you may be cheated in that context, but at least you get something. I think in this kind of in this online kind of vending on this kind of very low level, you wonder if you're even you're gonna get the product, and if the people are going to get your money, and I'm not sure quite how to develop that kind of sort of trust network. My friend Ruth has apparently done a pretty good job of cultivating a clientele who are confident in what she can do. But I think a lot of people are reluctant to do that.
Yeah, it's been really fascinating hearing about these specific challenges and the kind of the evolution of these different practices across two very specific sites. And actually, that's, I feel like, one of the advantages of using this lens of economic anthropology, of ethnography, because there's so much in the global discourse about entrepreneurship, there's so much in the media about social entrepreneurship. And lost within that is this kind of granular specificity. So just to end, I was wondering if, as economic anthropologists, if you could maybe say a few words about both the challenges or maybe even limitations of using this perspective, but also what you feel it provides or it adds to the general, there's so much about entrepreneurship and social entrepreneurship that we hear today. So what is it that economic anthropology can add as a unique perspective there?
Okay, I think that sort of takes us back to the first question. So I think I'll try to be very brief, and I will just again refer back to a point that Walt just raised, that looking at the real on the ground efficacy of social entrepreneurship, it means building relations of long-term trust with the people with whom we work. And just as Walt mentioned, he keeps in touch. I would make yearly visits to the Philippines. I would keep in touch with the people that I'm working with digitally, WhatsApp, Viber, as I can. I always work with a local community member as a research assistant, but also as a conduit. And I, try, COVID has been very challenging, to have her go out and just check in with the local communities. So it's this idea of building long-term trust and long-term relationships, and the challenge of keeping in touch with people, for me, halfway around the world, so that when you are there for a limited amount of time, you kind of pick up where you left off. And that way, you're able, through the economic anthropology lens, you're able to, see the fine grain logistics of what's going on with people's everyday life. I had another point. There's also the idea of contributing to the community. And the Philippines, as many people know, has this very long time, since the 1970s, and Ferdinand Marcos, the president, made outmigration a national development policy. We have Filipinos all over the world. So the remittance system is fine-tuned. All over Toronto, I have little Filipino grocery stores that, which is another project I'm working on, support the local community with all sorts of access to Philippine services. And one of them is remittances. And so for me, it's been extremely easy once I have people with a bank account to send funds. And I have to say that many of the rural artisans that I've worked with do not have a bank account still. So I send it to my research assistant, or I send it to a colleague at the University of the Philippines where I'm affiliated, and they help me disperse the funds. So it's a way of contributing to the community. Somebody's died in a family that you send money for a pig or whatever they're going to need for the funeral. You send funds for a typewriter, a new computer part. So different ways that you can contribute based on needs for community development. So that's, it's one of the ways to expand one's involvement, build relations of trust, and be there, in many ways. And I guess what I want to say is, to end, is that the social entrepreneurship model as a way to facilitate long-term sustainability, both social, culturally, community-wise, and income producing, it has a lot of flaws. It's not perfect. It's ongoing, as Walt has also mentioned. And yet it's a step forward, or maybe not forward, but it's a step in the right direction. So it's the idea of not throwing out a model that has things that could be improved. But for certainly the producer groups that I'm working with, it is an alternative to keep people home so that they're not out migrating, keep them less dependent on remittances, which promotes 80% of the Philippine economy right now. So it does present alternatives. And I think, given, as I mentioned before, the unambiguous small baby steps that have been made, it encourages social entrepreneurship to continue to tinker with the approach, and see where it can lead. Because the idea of having to outmigrate in the particular case of the Philippines, or depend so heavily on remittances, is really an untenable option, which has been presented, as the main one since the 1970s.
Yeah, for me, kind of what anthropology can bring to this discussion is kind of understanding from the ground up what entrepreneurship fundamentally means, and kind of like Lynn, I think the only way we can do that is by long-term, consistent field engagement with people. I think the best anthropology is coming from those of us who have made a commitment to a place and a people. And the only, and while it's good to branch out and do some comparison, I would much rather do my comparison via someone like Lynn, who knows her field site really well, than go to the Philippines myself. I'm not saying that I wouldn't want to go to the Philippines and visit Lynn when she's there, but I trust her to do the research. And it's that sort of back and forth that we develop through a network of scholars, I think, that helps us kind of bring in an anthropological perspective to this. The global discourses of social entrepreneurship, I think, are really powerful, but they're largely being generated by people who don't have deep knowledge of the places that they want to kind of import this perspective to. And I think the communication can be really poor between that level of development and the people that are supposed to receive this message. And I don't think anthropologists are necessarily, or should necessarily serve as the culture brokers between the two places. I think it's far more important to really understand what they are doing, what people are doing in the place, and what entrepreneurship means, and then how then the particular kind of social aspects and social responsibility that comes with it, rooted in those cultural places. So I'll focus more on that on the ground side of things than on the outside kind of imposition. And one of the curious things about Guatemala, but I think it's shared in lots of places throughout Latin America, it is that when they see a development initiative come into their community, it seems almost as if they're being asked to give up all the multiple things that they're doing and focus on that, right? I'm going to be a cheesemaker, or I'm going to make this type of woven product. And for some weavers, it squashes their creativity. They end up resisting those sorts of things. But for many families, they embrace a diversified base, and so they don't want to be pushed into any direction where they would specialize. And so, typical my household might have someone who goes and gets a degree to teach, and another person may take a degree in hotel and management, and someone else will farm, or someone else will learn to make cabinets, or someone else will weave, and all these different things contribute to the household to be kind of guided in a direction and say, well, the best thing to do here is weaving, or the best thing here is to develop coffee, would go contrary to how people on the ground actually want to do things and how they conceive of a business. They tend to have kind of connections in all sorts of different directions. And there's probably pretty good reasons, for wanting to diversify their base, given that, the things that Lynne was talking about earlier about, lack of infrastructure and crop insurance and a well-developed healthcare system, and you can go on and on and on of the kind of social safety net that's lacking in places like Guatemala. And so having a diversified base, economic base, means that you have some money coming in from somewhere all the time. And when you understand that, I think it helps us then understand how they embrace entrepreneurship in certain ways. And part of building that the kind of ground up social safety net means you're integrated with your community. So you can't develop or it's rather not wise to develop a business where you're going to exploit your neighbors. Lynne and Kate Brown did a really great edited volume for the Society for Economic Anthropology on the economy and morality. What was the Lynne will remember that title. I'm not getting it right.
No, yeah, economics and morality, anthropological approaches.
And one of the things that's important about many, if not all, the articles in it is that you understand the kind of local moral conditions by which economic practices take place, and anthropologists are able to kind of get at those things, and that underlying morality, I think, is important to driving social entrepreneurship. So I guess we've been thinking about this for a lot longer than I realized, Lynne.
Yes, I mean, there's so much that is, like we were saying, said about entrepreneurship, social entrepreneurship, but the long-term trust, commitment, and work that you've done with these communities, it shows maybe like the different types of things that they value beyond the financial value, the moral, the ethical, the socio-cultural, and also just the contradictions, the challenges, which can be really unique based on the geographical specificity comes out. So I think there's really this more complex, granulated picture of what social entrepreneurship really means from grounds up that I think economic anthropology provides that perspective. Thank you again so much for joining me today. That was a really amazing, fascinating discussion. So thank you so much.
Good. Thank you very much. Thanks for organizing it.
Absolutely. Thank you.